There's a strange moment that happens to people who grew up in the 1970s, a quiet realization that you don't just feel nostalgic, you feel slightly misaligned, not angry, not confused, just tuned to a different frequency. And that feeling isn't emotional, it's neurological. Because you didn't simply grow up in another decade, you grew up inside a completely different psychological environment. One where freedom was physical, not symbolic. Where you left the house without a phone, without tracking, without constant supervision. And that freedom wasn't framed as a reward. It was an expectation. You were trusted to navigate the world, manage risk, and return home when the streetlights came on. No reminders, no check-ins, no invisible safety net following you everywhere. Society assumed competence first, not fragility, and that assumption shaped your nervous system in ways that are almost impossible to recreate today. Risk wasn't eliminated, boredom wasn't treated like an emergency, discomfort wasn't immediately solved, and because of that, your brain learned something fundamental early on, that life doesn't constantly adjust itself to you, you adjust yourself to life. One of the first lessons every child of the 70's learned was how little sympathy the phrase, "I'm bored," received. Saying it didn't trigger entertainment or accommodation, it triggered responsibility. So you learned to solve boredom before it solved you. You weren't handed stimulation, you generated it. Empty time wasn't filled for you, it was something you had to confront. And psychologically, that M mattered far more than most people realize. Unstructured time forces the brain to organize itself without schedules, screens, or prompts telling you where to look next. Your attention turned inward. You had to decide what mattered, what held your interest, what was worth staying with. This is how executive function forms naturally. Planning, focus, persistence. But beneath that, something deeper developed. Competence. The quiet confidence that when nothing is happening, you can make something happen. You didn't grow up waiting for meaning to arrive prepackaged. You learned that meaning is often something you built. And that lesson doesn't disappear with age. It follows you into adulthood, which is why empty space doesn't panic you the way it seems to unsettle others. Silence doesn't feel threatening. Downtime doesn't automatically need to be filled. Your brain remembers a rule the modern world rarely teaches anymore. Engagement doesn't require constant stimulation. Sometimes it requires patience. You also learned about danger differently, not through warnings or explanations, but through direct experience. You climbed trees that were too high, rode bikes without helmets, explored places that were slightly unsafe, and figured out where the line actually was. And when you crossed it, your body learned the lesson firsthand. Scraped knees, broken bones, close calls. Pain wasn't a catastrophe, it was information. And neurologically that matters. When children experience manageable physical risk, the brain learns accurate threat assessment. The amygdala calibrates itself. You learn the difference between discomfort and danger by feeling it, not imagining it, which is why your baseline anxiety is often lower than people expect. You don't confuse uncertainty with catastrophe. When something goes wrong, your system doesn't immediately spiral. It assesses, this is why when chaos hits, you tend to get quieter, while others explain, react, or emotionally amplify the situation. Something in you shifts into problem-solving mode. Not because you don't care, but because caring was never expressed through noise, it was expressed through action. Your nervous system learned early that urgency doesn't require panic, it requires orientation. You also learned how to be alone before being alone became something to fear. Long stretches of your childhood were quiet by modern standards. No constant notifications, no algorithm pulling your attention every few seconds. You spent hours with music, thoughts, or nothing at all. And because escape wasn't immediately available, your brain learned to tolerate its own inner space. This built a capacity that's quietly disappearing. Comfortable solitude, not isolation, not withdrawal, but the ability to remain present with your own thoughts without needing distraction or validation. Silence didn't signal danger, it signaled rest. And that skill stayed with you. Waiting rooms don't agitate you. Long drives don't feel unbearable. You don't need constant stimulation to feel regulated. Waiting itself used to be built into life. You waited for shows, waited for photos TE. Oh, develop. Waited to hear someone's voice on the phone and hoped they were home. Nothing arrived instantly, and no one considered that a flaw. Psychologically, this shaped your relationship with reward. Anticipation mattered, effort mattered, follow-through mattered. Dopamine wasn't dumped all at once, it was spread across time. And that wiring created patience, impulse control, and depth. You learned that wanting something didn't mean getting it immediately, and that this didn't reduce its value, it often increased it. Which is why instant gratification rarely satisfies you for long, not because you're hard to please, but because your reward system wasn't trained to burn itself out chasing constant hits. By the time you were 8 or 9, you were already managing real autonomy. You navigated neighborhoods, woods, and unfamiliar places without supervision, and when something went wrong, you figured it out or lived with the consequences. This built a strong internal locus of control. The belief that your actions matter and your decisions carry weight, but that strength came with a quiet cost. When children learn to manage themselves early, they often learn to contain emotions as well as behavior. You became excellent at functioning quietly, handling problems without making them visible. Which is why self-reliance feels natural to you, and asking for help can feel unnecessary or uncomfortable, not because you don't value connection, but because your system learned survival didn't depend on it. As the world changed, that wiring didn't disappear, and sometimes it clashes with modern life, the speed, the noise, the constant explanation, and emotional broadcasting. To you, much of it feels excessive, not because you resist change, but because your nervous system was shaped in an environment where attention was stable and competence was demonstrated quietly. So when you pause, instead of reacting, when you don't feel compelled to narrate every internal state, it can be misread as distance or disengagement. But it isn't. It's calibration. Your system prioritizes depth over speed and substance over signal. The world you grew up in is gone, and it isn't coming back in the same form, but the wiring it gave you still matters. The ability to tolerate boredom, assess risk accurately, remain steady under pressure, and function without constant feedback. These aren't outdated traits. They're anchors, and in moments that require restraint, clear thinking, and quiet competence, they still hold everything together even if no one notices. And maybe that's the defining trait of people who grew up in the 1970s. Not nostalgia, not toughness, but the ability to stay grounded in a world that keeps trying to turn everything into noise.